Now, you might be wondering, why would the fact that Dr. Jekyll lives in a neighborhood where a lot of these really nice old houses have been converted into flats, why would that even matter at all in terms of the story? Well, it does matter in terms of the story, maybe not in the author's really real original intentions, but it's had a lot of different interpretations in terms of the way critical readers have looked at it in terms of psychoanalysis, right? So if we're going to look at this giant house for a moment, right? And let's say there's another like pretty giant house next to it, right? And right, and the thing is one house, right, is being divided into flats, right? And this other one is just kind of one resident, right? Everything is together and it's part of one houses. Part of the idea that's being suggested here is the contrast between having kind of one whole person and divided sections of one psychology, right? Because the thing is that Dr. Jekyll gives the appearance, because he's still, unlike a lot of people who've converted these houses into flats, maybe because they didn't want to live in that neighborhood anymore, maybe it's too close to a bad neighborhood. It's still a good neighborhood, but they can also make a lot of money off of these old houses by converting them into apartments downtown. If you didn't know that, there are a lot of nice houses near the middle of cities that get converted into apartments by people just because there's so much money to be made by converting them into expensive apartments. But in this case, as we know, Dr. Jekyll, right, does not just have the one house, right? He also has, the house is connected at the back to another old house to which you have, you know, and this is, it goes all the way back and you see kind of the big round door, right? The big round door that's at the back of the laboratory, and that's where you meet Mr. Hyde and Mr. Enfield encounters the story of the door. The idea about this, it basically is suggesting a couple of things in this metaphor. Number one, most people know nothing about this second part of the house, right? This second part, which is actually kind of detached, right? And so one of the things we know is that since we know that Dr. Jekyll is also Edward Hyde, sorry guys, I couldn't do this analysis without telling you, right? The idea is that unlike most people who you're aware, right, that they have multiple sides of themselves, like, you know, that London flat is divided up and, you know, people have different roles and different responsibilities. Jekyll, right, is literally one face to the world, but there's this other whole second part of him, right, that nobody knows about, right? Where these things that he's beginning to do, because even before he becomes Mr. Hyde, you have to understand that Dr. Jekyll is taking part in these heretical experiments in order to create Mr. Hyde, right? This is one of those parallels that we also see with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Because the thing is if we remember the story of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the main character, the protagonist, Victor Frankenstein, right? He was setting out to conquer death, just as in his own way, Dr. Jekyll is seeking out in his experiments to conquer evil, right? And what he ends up doing in order to conquer evil is he has to have a secret laboratory and secret places for his experiments, right? He's doing a lot of things which are illegal in order for Victor to accomplish his experiment. But the idea of duality, a public face and a private face, is very much a big part of Frankenstein as well. Because by day, right, Frankenstein is a respected doctor, just like Henry Jekyll. But at night, in order to create his monster, which is made out of human cadavers, right, we know that at night, Victor Frankenstein has a secret lab, and he is grave robbing, right, and playing God. In the same sense, right, the idea that he has separated himself in these two parts, but the only real public part, of Victor Frankenstein's life is his doctor part, not any of his secret weird experiments. Because when he creates the monster, he doesn't tell anybody, because no one has any idea that these experiments are even going on. And initially, right, Frankenstein could have destroyed the monster rather quickly had he only been willing to confess what he had done. Had he been willing to confess what he had done, that he'd created this abomination or this thing that he'd lost control of, if he'd been willing to get other people involved, then everything could have been fine. They could have found the creature quickly, and if necessary, they could have destroyed it. But Frankenstein doesn't tell anybody for a long time. In fact, he doesn't tell anyone the complete story till the end of his life, which is actually when the novel begins. If you haven't read Frankenstein, he actually tells his story to a captain who kind of finds him nearly frozen near the Arctic Circle, and he's telling everything back. So Frankenstein's story is actually a confession. And in the same way, the final part of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is you're going to be reading a letter written by Henry Jekyll, which is his last confession, right? So this is another one of the parallels. But the idea is most of us kind of know that we're all a mixture of good and bad, right? And in the same way with the London flats, right? These are really expensive apartments. The idea of a place where there used to be nothing but mansions, and now there are expensive apartments, right? This is kind of a metaphor for the deterioration of a neighborhood, right? It's known that places that are housing that people own rather than housing that people rent, that shows a decline in the neighborhood, right? The traditional mansion is going away and the new apartments are coming in. This is to demonstrate the degradation of the socioeconomic situation, maybe of where Mr. Hyde lives. We already know that if you go through the back and you see the place where the laboratory is, it doesn't look like it's in as nice of a neighborhood. It doesn't look very nice at all. So we know that Dr. Jekyll, by keeping this one house as one thing, right, he's still keeping up the appearance of tradition and propriety, right? The idea is that he's still part of the same old guard, the same old wealthy class, not letting go of his beautiful house in this old neighborhood, not letting the neighborhood turn into something else. And while he is portraying himself as whole and simple and good, right, while the other houses are known to be complex, right, what we know is that this one good house, right, because it has like a rear house, a rear laboratory that most people don't know about, this face actually has a dark side. While this more complicated thing where we kind of know that it's deteriorating, not necessarily in a bad way, but there's something about the idea that if we were to use these houses as symbols of persons, right, we usually are able to tell with most persons that they're a mix of all sorts of different kinds of things, some good, some bad, some ugly, some beautiful, but we kind of feel like we see the whole picture. But the simple Henry Jekyll, who is all good, right, by him trying to create this duality of black and white, we know that even though this mansion and this wholeness is a symbol of propriety, right, it is actually more of the idea of what happens when you're trying to be all good, and then there's this secret dark side you don't see. The thing is, and I hope you've all known this, but when people sometimes are super nice to us, we often think that maybe they have an agenda. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but have you ever met a Christian person who's just so nice all the time? You think maybe they're a little crazy, or they're trying to butter you up, or they want something from you, right? Hi, how you doing? And like immediately you're just like, what is with this guy, right? In fact, there's actually a book written by Dostoevsky about this called The Idiot. And in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, there's this character by the name of Prince Mishkin, who's like a Christ character. And basically the thing is, Mishkin is so innocent and so without guile and without gall that everyone oftentimes think he's playing some kind of angle, right? It's not always the case, because in the Idiot, Prince Mishkin is entirely good. But it shows that the impression that we get when something portrays itself as being all white, all whole, all good, nothing wrong, nothing bad, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, says the man in The Wizard of Oz, right? We kind of have this idea that maybe there's something else going on under the veneer, right? The veneer, another word for surface, right? Something going on underneath the surface, right? So one of the things that we talked about in our chat session, remember, honor students, your mandatory chat session is on Thursdays. right? And the first one was optional, but this next one coming up is mandatory, right? Is that the book emphasizes duality, and it also tells its story in duality. We have, in the case of, we see the contrast in the houses, the contrast between the front and the back of the house, the disasters that relies with these doctors having this secret lab and secret experiments that they're doing. But one of the things is that we see that when Dr. Jekyll calls Lanyon a pedant in his private conversation with Utterson, we see that he's a bit scatterbrained, right? We see that he's trying to change the subject, right? And all of this is being told in complete contrast to the other character in the conversation. And the other character in the conversation is, who will I call on? I'll call on you, Mr. Hood, who's the other person in this conversation with Jekyll. That is correct. It is Gabriel Utterson, just off Gus's front leg, right? That we know that the story is constantly being told in contrast, right? There's a scene of a beautiful Sunday stroll, right, which is being contrast with a night child attack, right? We know, right, that Jekyll, who right now is trying to distract Utterson, is encountering someone who is not giving a false smile, not trying to hide anything, but is maintaining super focused, super authentic, super sincere, right? The opposite of what Jekyll is being in this scene. Everything about this story has always a frame of duality and contrast to it. The duality and the contrast that we're seeing expressed in these somewhat subtle ways is trying to belay an overall important theme in the text of Jekyll and Hyde. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in the next section, but to remember, this is a story that is being told in contrast, and it's about duality.